short, brief agenda. Why NGINX Unit? Then the hosting variants of NGINX Unit I have. And short introduction about the Unit PHP SDK I built. And I created extra for the conference to have a bit more experience with the SDK and something I can really show to you, an NGINX Unit controller, where we have a web application demo of the web SDK. And a couple of words about the security. So as you remember, once upon a time as a developer, started writing PHP applications for huge enterprises, there was a common old way of shipping your applications to the production workloads. I mean, you developed it on your machines and shipped your production-ready code in a zip archive or tar.gz file as an email or something to the dev or to the ops guys. And they read maybe your deployment instructions or maybe not, and put your code in some directory on the web server and restarted it, and that's it. So that was the way I deployed tons of PHP applications in the past. And anytime you had some changes to the server API of PHP, that means PHP ini stuff, it was possible. I mean, you can write it down in some deployment specification you shipped along with your production-ready code, but it's up to the ops guy to read it or not. So that happened that most of the time it ended up in some problems because some variables in the PHP file was not really set, the limits were not correct or something. So then you ended up in a process like, hey, we need a change request for this and you need to wait 2 weeks. And that's the end of this story. If you're not dead while waiting on a change, maybe you will be happily after still living and developing PHP applications. But as we heard today at the keynote, it's absolutely important that a developer or engineer has a full control over the whole stack. That means over the application server, the application code itself, and the deployment and anything else. So that's all what we want, right? The only thing we want is a full knowledge and a full control over our control plane and the application plane. So, and that's why NGINX Unit can give us benefits from both sides, from dev side, on the engineering side, and the ops side. So for the ops, it's an absolutely good thing with Unit, and you have a consistent application delivery stack regardless the language you're using in NGINX Unit. That means for an ops guy, it's like with NGINX Unit, you can handle Unit or the API in the same way with PHP, with Node, with Go, with Python, with Ruby, with anything else. It's just the same kind of application server. And from a developer perspective, if it's easy to configure and if you can provide some, in my case, an SDK or something where you can easily hook into the configuration, that's from the development perspective even a good thing just to use it, because you don't need to deal with the Unit API. You can just use the and specify the things you need, and that's it. So that's why NGINX Unit can build a bridge between those things. Unit itself is very small and lightweight. It's easy to install and configure, very flexible, as we can see in the demo. And the upcoming features there in the pipeline so far are pretty good. So that's why I'm really looking forward to it. A brief overview over the hosting variants I'm using with NGINX Unit in production. I have a standalone Unit installation. That means you have one Unit installation on a single VM, and one team can control the full NGINX Unit instance by itself. You do not need to protect anything on the Unit instance because you have one team which is responsible for the whole instance. Then you can have standalone for Kubernetes or Docker. It means you deploy NGINX Unit in the container, but with the same thing. One team for the container, full control, no regulations. The last thing is something interesting because I have a shared Unit instance, and with a shared Unit instance, there comes one problem. You have multiple teams on the same instance, and how you protect your Unit application server for, let's say, team A is not able to change the application from team B, or team B is not able to change a listener from team A. But you just want one unit. You don't want to spin up a new instance just because of another team, you know? And for this, I wrote some NGINX things, but they're absolutely way too complex to show it here in 30 minutes. So that's why I have a simple demo here, or a simple configuration example as an idea how to do it. So what you can do is you can say an NGINX Plus or open source instance as a proxy, as a simple reverse proxy, and say you have a location team A listener is proxying a request to the NGINX unit control port or upstream to config listeners, and then you specify the listener name. And then you can protect this with an, let's say, HTTP basic auth or client certificate or JOTS on NGINX unit plus or something. So that's an idea of how to protect an NGINX unit instance with NGINX Plus or open source for a shared environment. Then you can have multiple teams working with one unit instance and protect the sources or the applications from one team against another. As I said, just a simple example because this is very static. This example means you need to do this configuration anytime something changed on unit. That's not really efficient, but it's just for an idea. It's not really something you should definitely do in production. So then why I build the SDK, the PHP SDK or JavaScript SDK for Unit. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Unit. Have anybody used Unit before? Just, okay. Then just one word about Unit. So Unit is the application server you can configure over JSON files via a REST API. That means you can send a JSON payload to a REST API endpoint, and that configures the application server for you. And if you end up in some story like writing 10 times, 20 times a JSON file and editing stuff manually in a JSON file and just send it via curl or something or Postman to your instance, you will think about it, maybe that's not the right way to do it because it's not really bulletproof. You know, sometimes, to be honest, you just do copy paste from one JSON to another, then you miss something, then the listener configuration is not correct, then you have some sort of other problems pointing to a wrong listener from the wrong application, and yeah, that was the main reason why I thought about creating some stack above the JSON configuration. And addition to this, if it comes to something like routes and matches, we will see that in the demo, it's getting more complex writing JSON files because then they are very nested. You have objects in objects, and then you have arrays in an object, so it's not really nice to write a JSON file like this just in an editor. Yeah, that's the main reason why I built the SDK for PHP and JavaScript. Just before we start with the demo, a brief introduction into Unit itself, because I thought not so many hands about the usage of Unit. So if you want to install Unit, there are a couple of ways to do it. We use the easy way, let's say. Let's assume we have a CentOS 7 virtual machine, make it simple. Then we can use the pre-built packages of Unit. And there are two things we should know. As I pointed here, we have the Unit installation. I can have some right thing here. Where's my laser pointer? Nice. That means we need to install Unit itself. That's the application server itself. And per language, Unit provides a module. And for PHP, you have different modules for different languages. That means you have Unit PHP 5.6, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. And an important thing you should know is this module is implementing the server API, is talking to the server API of PHP. It's like the FPM or like a CGI proxy. It's nothing, so it not tells you that you do not need to install PHP on your system anymore. You definitely need to do this step again. So this is something you still need to do. You need to install Unit packages, and then you need the PHP modules and the PHP binaries, if you will, on your system. Right, so that's the important thing. But for the PHP binary packages, I personally use the README repository since years without any major outages or trouble with it. So from my personal perspective, I highly recommend using the README repositories for installing PHP in your system. It's like they are building it from source, from the official source from the GitHub repository, and providing RPMs and the repository where you can easily jump install whatever you want. So that's my recommendation. And even Unit supports the README repositories right now, so that's a good thing. Then just here a small thing, I discovered, or I opened the RPM of the Unit PHP module with this command. It's something helpful if you want it. And as you can see, you have the debug, the module here, and this PHP Unit module is the part talking to the PHP server API. So on that one, that's, as you see, that's the only thing what get installed when you do the Unit PHP module installation. There's not really a PHP binary. That comes as a dependency when you try to install it with Jam. It means when you try to Jam install PHP 7.2 module for Unit, Jam tells you, hey, you need PHP common, you PHP CLI, you PHP JSON, whatever, as a dependency. And as you can see here, it comes out of the README repository. Is it big enough for you? Yeah? Yeah, that's what I said. So it's highly recommended you set up the repositories first, set up the Unit repository, install the EPEL repository as well as the README, and then go and install the Unit modules, and any additional PHP stuff you want, like the internal extension, MB string, PDO, whatever you want. So then I have another thing. I created a PHP version manager, like the Ruby version manager, just for PHP, where you can easily switch between the versions on my system. Because I install the PHP 7.3, 5.6, 7.2, 7.1 on one system. And when I use something like composers, tools like this, it's sometimes better to switch to the original language. It means when your application running on PHP 7.2, for example, I personally want to use Composer with PHP 7.2, not 7.3. That's why I have the PVM written, doing some management in the background for me and setting some binaries, changing the version of PHP system-wide. Right, so the NGINX Unit SDK for PHP, that will be open sourced soon. I'm just writing some more tests to it, and then I think it's ready to go. It contains a couple of files. Unit is the basic implementation talking with the Unit server. Then we have Unit PHP. That's let's say an extension of the Unit object having PHP custom functionalities in it, like the PHP ini file, some admin settings for PHP applications in general. A Unit listener. A listener in Unit is something that connects your application, let's say, to the outside world. Maybe you can say, create a listener with a specific port and bind this listener to an application. That's the way how you can talk to your application from outside the world. Routes is something I can show you in the controller demo. That's why I built them. And Unit security is doing some sort of TLS certificate creation. That means anytime you specify a listener or route, in that case a listener, to be secure, we are creating, or the SDK creating an X509 certificate and place it into Unit. And that's why I have an HTTPS connection to your Unit instance. But this is something I can show you in the controller demo. Yeah, so the SDK basically do the configuration of the Unit application server from inside the PHP application. That means I ship an ini file or a simple PHP array with my configuration settings with my application. And at the time the application got deployed or the Docker container starts up, I don't know, sometimes it's a far archive with some applications I'm just executing, or another application has an endpoint, I can curl to it and just send a GET request to a specific endpoint, and that's reconfiguring the application server for me. That means it is, if you remember the first slide of my presentation, so it's much easier with this setting to reconfigure your application server, because the only thing you need to do is you change inside your PHP application some settings, deploy it, and the application server got configured for you automatically without any problems. That means you can specify your, let's say, your maximum upload size or your post limits or something like show the PHP version or show error levels or something. It's completely up to you. That's nothing the ops need to handle. So I think it was enough for a talk just at the last talk. Let's do this. Oh, it's working. Escape. Let's get exit the presentation. Go out. Right. Yes, so that's the NGINX unit controller. It's not even a week old. It's just created for conf. So what we can see here is something called the unit registry. And so anytime I create a new unit instance, it's sending a curl request to an endpoint I specified, telling my controller, hey, I'm here. Do whatever you want with me, but I'm here. And then we see here 3 different stages. This instance here with a green on-off sign and the green color saying it's on and healthy. Then we have another with a green border, but a red sign it's not flashing. And that's telling us, hey, I'm just offline. That means somebody shut me down, but it was not accidentally. It was just, we don't need it, so we shut it down. It's still there, but we don't need it. This guy here with his flashing on-off sign is unhealthy. That means it was up and running, but it got killed or, I don't know, terminated, whatever, but it's not reachable right now, but it should be there because nobody told their unit controller this instant got shut it down. So we can make it green again. That means when I start the Docker container with the unit in it, then it's finger are too fat for typing, I think. Was it the right one? I think. No, it was not the right one. What was the AC5 then? Yep, that was the right one. So that means, and when I kill the instance again, that means when I say, okay, not stopping, but killing, do the trick, and I kill the instance. Nope. Why is it green? Okay. Anyway. I'll try later when we have time. So then you can click on manage the instance, and then you see the applications running currently on top of unit. The controller we see here is something that runs on top of unit, of course. And I will explain right now how unit works based on the application here, because it's much easier than on the SDK. So, of course, an application needs a name. It means if you want to create an application, you just need to specify a name. Let's say unit controller in that case. Then you need a couple of initial settings for a PHP application, like the PHP version you want to use. Let's say PHP 7.3, 7.2, 5.6. That depends on the modules you have installed on your application server. Okay, the document root is something important. That means where your PHP files are living. And they're not get copied into unit or something. They need to be physically there over time. It's important. Just remember the PHP unit application server is something like the FPM in that case. That means it's nothing else. So the files should be there all the time. Otherwise, it will not work. Then you can use or specify a run user and a group, as in the FPM as well. And then you have a handler type like index or script. And that is a little bit tricky, but that is something I can show you later in this demo. Handler type is in that case how NGINX unit handles requests to this application. If you have something like script, anytime you call this single file will be executed. And when you specify like index, every request that can't be found or the file can't be found on the application server will redirect it to the index. It's a good setting for WordPress like this or Symfony or Cake PHP or something where you have a single entry point into your application. So these are the PHP admin options. It means expose PHP is off. The memory limit is 256 meg. Display errors. And in this section, you can set up something like max post size or something like this. Then let's come to a listener, to the listener configuration. As I said, a listener is is the main way into your application. You need to specify a listener, and a listener is something unique per unit instance. That means you can't say, I want to have a listener port 8700 and another listener port 8700. That's not possible. So the listener is something you need to be unique per instance. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating the proxy configuration for my NGINX instance that I can just copy paste it, because there's one interesting thing. If you have an API just responding with JSON or XML file to your endpoint, calling it, you're absolutely fine with just unit. If you have anything else like WordPress or Cake PHP or Symfony or something that ships some assets, images, JavaScript files, CSS, NGINX can't send these files right now. It will be a feature in the future, but at the moment you need something like NGINX open source in front of it, shipping these files for you. That's why here's the application. The document root is specified again on the NGINX open source, and here are the proxy passes to NGINX unit. And that makes it a little bit more clear right now. It's like the FPM setup on unit or on NGINX today. Route and matchers. This is something interesting. That's a feature I used since last year at Conf. This is something you can modify the behavior of your application. That means what you can do is you can, let's say, this application here, for example, does not allow the HTTP method put on the application server level. That means if anybody tries to send a put request to your application, NGINX unit does not process the request. NGINX unit blocks it and send a 400 with an error, or 404 with an error message to your client. The same thing with host names. That means if you specify something like localhost, or in that case an IP address, and you curl this endpoint or want to enter this endpoint with something else, unit will serve a 404 with an error message because it's not really configured here. Right. So that's the main idea behind route matchers. You can do a lot of more things with route matchers, but I'm pretty sure there is enough stuff with routes and matchers fill a whole talk. So I think that should be fine. So when we create an application here, a new one, so we can easily do this. Let's create app name 2, for example, with user index, script is fine. This is testing, PHP 7.3. So then I have here something like create default listener. And the default listener means the SDK knows the listener on the instance and will get the next report automatically for you and just create a listener for you and assign it to your application. That means when I say, okay, fine, do this, I created, reconfiguration done. Let's go back, and there should now something like app 2, and we got port, there was app 2 before. So that means we have now 2 listeners, 8740, and with 2 listeners. Because I specified the app 2 before, and what you see here is now, that's interesting. When you, as I did, when I created the app name 2 application a second time, so what happened then is unit accept the put method to the API. That means my old application setup was now updated with my new one, but it was another listener added to the application. But that's a good example because you can see now you can add multiple listeners to your application. In that case, we have 2. Right. So then I have something like, that's part of the old thing. So let's get rid of it. Let's delete the application. So what the SDK is doing some kind of garbage collection. It's deleting the routes. If you don't have any routes, then it's fine. It's deleting the listeners, and it's deleting the application at the end. Right. So this is something I want to show you because of the TLS support. It was here. So that means at the moment the port 8710 is accessible via HTTP. That means when we do here curl let's say HTTP, then we have localhost port A710, I think. Yes, it's printing out something that's another application reconfiguring unit, and that's HTTP right now. And when I say, okay, I want to add the listener and say enable TLS for me, and say save configuration, it's done. So then it's showing here, it is secured, and when I click on it, it shows the certificate that was generated. And when I'm trying to do this again, right, I will see the error because I'm sending HTTP request to an HTTPS endpoint. And because I was lazy and not specified the CA in the PEM file, I need to do this, and as you can see, now it's an encryption. So then we have an encrypted connection to our application. And so the SDK can do the same things, but it is not nice to show you an ini file in just PHP code. That's why I have the controller right now and can show you this in a little application. And so behind the hood, it's nothing more than just a wrapper around some curl requests or a curl library to send requests to unit. So anything what I've done here right now with clicking around and fill out some text inputs is something you can easily do by just writing your own JSON files and sending it to unit. For example, when we want to see the whole configuration, what we can do is we can just curl the unit endpoint. Let's make it a little bit full size. So that's the actual NGINX Unit endpoint. I will come in the security section a couple of minutes along this one, why or when using ports and sockets, and what is the advantage and disadvantage of one of these options. So as you can see, we have our listeners. This one is secure right now with the TLS support with our generated cert. Then we have here our application objects. That's the unit controller. That's the test1 application. That's another conf test application. That's app name 2. That's that one we just generated. Then we have here our route objects. Yeah, and as you can see, that's what I mean. You know, if you wrote this thing 10 times or 20 times, then you definitely think about creating some programs for it, because, yeah. Yeah, but that's basically how that configuration works. You just need to call the REST endpoint with a given JSON, and that's basically it. And that's what I'm wrapping in the unit controller with an application. So at the moment, I have the SDK for JavaScript as well as for PHP. So the PHP one, I need to write some more tests for it, some unit tests, and then I can think about it, open source it if needed in a couple of weeks. Depends on my workload. Right. So what else I can show you with the so what we have here. So I have prepared some application here. That means we have the application running on test 2, I think. Yeah, that one. And what I can do is I can say, hey, this application is now available just internally, so we definitely want to use a JSON web token as an authentication. So please add the bearer header as a must-have to my application configuration instead of allowing every traffic. So then specify, let's say, our given host names. And say, okay, yeah, please activate the route for config. That's because when I generate the application initially, the listener points directly to the application. And as soon as you create some routes or matches, the listener points to your route object and the route points to your application. That's something you should know. But I can show you this later in a minute here. Then I say, okay, configure. It's done. Then when we go here down to our application, we see that here, the listener changed. That means right now it's telling us it's going over routes conf test and not applications conf test. And then we see here the headers section added some authorization bearer. That means when I do this and press, it's not going to work anymore. because unit telling me, hey, guy, you're missing some better header, so you see this 404 message with an error here. So that's a cool thing, because that's absolutely easy, and this is something the developer can do, and not the ops guy anymore. Right. So security. There's just one more sentence about it. Yeah. The thing with the NGINX unit control plane or controller port is you can configure NGINX unit while it's starting to be able to be configured over an IPv4 with a port, like in that case, localhost in port 8900. And you can tell unit in the default way it's configurable via a unit socket. In my specific use case with the NGINX unit controller, it's better to be able to be configurable over IP and port, because it's much easier then to configure it. But you need to know one thing about it. If you configure unit to be able to be configured over IP and port instead of a unit socket, you definitely need to protect your config endpoint when you want to expose it to some internal or even external network, because unit itself does not do any protection against this control port. This is something definitely you should know. It means when you run unit with IP and port instead of the socket, just put an NGINX Plus or open source proxy in front of it and protect with basic auth, client certificates, JOTs, whatever you want, but protect it. Don't expose the port 8900 just with your IP table to the outside world. It's not a good idea. Protect it. You can use it, but be aware of the protection then. Yeah, what's on the radar with the stuff here? I'm thinking about it rewriting the unit controller and Kotlin or Java within React.js frontend and ship it as a single jar file. If more people want something like this, if because it's at least a couple of weeks of extra work, so I can definitely do this, but it depends on let's say the feedback of the audience if it's needed. For sure, I will open source the PHP and JavaScript SDKs in a couple of weeks or months, depending on my workload. And I created a domain tivex.io. It's not up and running yet, but you can visit it in a couple of days and weeks, and I will publish all my updates to this domain, as well as some, if you're interested, I have tons of documentation written in the last year for myself, and I really think about it, just put it there as an, let's say, source of knowledge from my brain, like a brain dump for me and for you. You can use it for your own applications. Well, the source, the nodes here, the README repository is something, if you don't know about it, you should definitely dig into it and read about it, because it's absolutely worth it for PHP. Yeah, the security picture, thanks for giving me that picture. And yeah, for updates of the unit control and the PHP SDK, visit the website. I will be updated it in a couple of weeks. Or you contact me on LinkedIn or in the app or here, or whatever. We'll be around the whole week. So if there's no questions or nothing, we can. Yeah, live. Yep.
If I may. First off, how long did this take you?
Sorry, the controller? So I had vacation last week, so it was it was almost, let's say, a week, 50 hours of development. Like, yeah.
Secondly, is there any kind of logging of the alterations that you do, the API calls that you make into the configuration API?
You mean if unit logs the calls I do against unit?
No, if your controller logs the calls that you make into the reconfiguration API,
not
so you
now.
can audit the.
Oh no, not now.
Okay.
At the moment, it's like fire and forget. I'm sending the configuration, then I'm out. But it's a good idea. It could be helpful to say or to log something like I configured this and that for you, or have some historical JSON data. Yeah, it's a good idea.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you.